My name's Gavin Lindberg. I live in Germantown, Maryland. The title I'm most proud of is Evan's dad, and I'm also the co-founder and president of the Evan Foundation, which is an organization that my wife and I established in memory of our son. Well, Evan was our only child, and he was the light of our lives. He was perfect in every way up until about 3 years old. And so take you back to the fall of 2006, and he started to experience really debilitating leg pain. Um, and this was a kid who was not a complainer. He was, a kid who loved to be outside and running, and was not prone to complaining at all. And he really was struggling with this leg pain. And we took him to his local pediatrician here a couple of times, and she was sort of scratching her head. And this was a wonderful pediatrician. She'd been in practice for, a good 3 decades. I'll never forget it. On one of those visits, she said, I'm going to call someone smarter than me about your son. And of course, a statement like that gets your attention, right? She made that phone call, and the advice was for us to take Evan to our local hospital here and get a CT scan of his abdomen. That was the very beginning of our journey. So Evan got the CT scan, and immediately we received the results that it had shown a large mass in his abdomen, on his right adrenal gland specifically. And that night, this is in September of 2006, we were admitted to the oncology floor at Children's National Hospital in Washington, D.C. And over the course of the next few days, had a battery of tests that told his oncologist that Evan had something called stage 4 NMIC amplified neuroblastoma. And it had spread everywhere in his body, with the exception of the central nervous system. So Evan had disease from head to toe in his bone marrow, and soft tissue. And that leg pain that he was experiencing was really where it was manifesting itself in his bones and his legs, which is why he was hurting. Like all cancer diagnoses, right? That's a day that we'll never forget. And it started us off on a 4 year treatment journey. Over the course of 4 years, Evan was treated at 3 hospitals on the East Coast here of the US. And, to say that it was long, devastating, excruciating, that would be a ridiculous understatement. Evan never had a day off in 4 years. He was either in treatment or in recovery, and frequently the recovery was worse than the treatment. And, with these neuroblastoma patients, they really get everything but the kitchen sink in terms of the oncology therapeutic arsenal. So essentially, you name an oncology treatment, and there's a high likelihood that my son received it. And, as he went through this, just torturous journey, he relapsed multiple times in the brain, and that required multiple brain surgeries. And, to combat all this, Evan enrolled in 4 phase 1 clinical trials from the age of 3 to 7, if you can fathom that. And I don't think I have to, perhaps tell the audience that a phase 1 clinical study is really looking at safety. You're hoping for some efficacy, but you're really looking for safety indications. And Evan he was a pioneer, really. He was a pioneer in the utilization of immunotherapy and molecular targeted therapy in neuroblastoma, paving the way for other children after him, for which I'm incredibly proud. And speaking of being proud, I'm just struck to this day by my son's remarkable courage and grace in the face of something so evil as high-risk neuroblastoma. And, I try to take those lessons that he taught me throughout my life. And he not only taught me, but he taught everyone around him who had the privilege to be with him, that despite the ravages of neuroblastoma, it was not winning. Evan never, ever, not one single day, let neuroblastoma define him. And he lived life on his terms. And he was always spreading his joy to the people that he spent time with. So his mom and I, we focus on Evan, not so much on neuroblastoma. And Evan has beaten neuroblastoma many, many times and in many ways. Caring for a sick child, it's all encompassing, particularly with something as devastating as high-risk neuroblastoma. It simply takes over your life. So, you're either dealing with the impact of treatment, you're trying to determine, what the next treatment should be, you're trying to provide your child with, some sense of normalcy, which we strove mightily, my wife and I, to do. We wanted him to, as much as possible, grow up in a way and in an environment at home that, focused on his childhood and not the disease. And, frequently you're doing all of those things in the same day. And it's incredibly, and this is an understatement as well, but it is incredibly challenging to do. So absolutely, there were sacrifices, both professionally and personally, particularly given that, we traveled so much for Evan's treatment. So we're here in the Washington, D.C. area. We spent a lot of time, at our local hospital in Washington, but also a lot of time in New York City and a lot of time in Philadelphia. I keep coming back to the phrase all encompassing, but I think that is really hitting the nail on the head. It was never lost on my wife and I that, again, Evan was our only child. So I think in some ways it was perhaps a little easier for us to manage all of that because, we met so many families along our treatment journey who not only had the little boy or the little girl battling high-risk neuroblastoma, but they had a second child, a third child, a fourth child, a fifth child in some cases. That, of course, just adds to the complexities of how this impacts your life personally and professionally. I'm not quite sure how those families did it. I'm sure they would tell you all about sacrifices as well, given the fact that they had more than one child to try to help. So my first message would be hopeful. Hope and optimism are contagious within a family, and I think that's incredibly important. I know it's incredibly important. And as devastating as high-risk neuroblastoma diagnosis is today, I think it's, helpful perhaps to recognize that it doesn't necessarily have to be as devastating as it was almost 20 years ago now for our family. There are new treatments that are available. There are promising new therapies in the pipeline. We have an incredibly talented group of neuroblastoma investigators doing remarkable work in the lab, striving to develop new therapies for these kids. So that would be my first message. My second message is immediately become your child's advocate. Speak with as many experts in the field as you can, both clinical folks and research folks. It's unfortunate, but it's true. Mom and dad, they really have to familiarize themselves with this terrible disease as quickly as they can to ensure their child gets the best treatment. And, you go from a circumstance, and I think this is true for almost every family, you go from a circumstance where literally 1 minute you do not know, you have never heard the word neuroblastoma. You don't know how to spell it, you don't know what it is, and then you're being told that your child has it. And it is just one of the most challenging and devastating diagnoses that a family can get. And immediately, mom and dad have to become an expert. But the good news here is that both the neuroblastoma clinical community and the research community are full of amazing people, as I mentioned, and they're very open to speaking with newly diagnosed families. They want to be helpful, they want to take that phone call. And parents, as difficult as it is overcoming the shock of getting a diagnosis, if you're not being given them, you've got to ask for information about experts in the field, and you've got to pick up the phone and you've got to introduce yourself and you've got to have those conversations. That would be my other word of advice. Well, I'll start by saying, fortunately, we had a diagnosing oncologist who described the various treatment options that we could pursue. We were provided with names of experts and phone numbers to contact to have some follow-up conversations, if we wanted to do that. And I did want to do that, and I did do that. And again, I will emphasize the importance of doing that to anybody. I think it's critical. And that allowed us to make an informed decision from the start. And I felt, and I still feel this way, very fortunate that that occurred because I understand that that does not happen with every new diagnosis. So again, my message would be, if you're not receiving that information, to ask for it. And I would go so far as to say, if you were being treated by someone at that diagnosis phase who's reluctant to give you information on other providers, other experts to call, then perhaps you may be in the wrong place. Because I think it's important with such a devastating disease that parents are able to communicate with as many experts as possible. And then, of course, there are resources that are available as well, online, that are, through centers of excellence that care for patients with neuroblastoma, through patient-driven organizations who have excellent peer-reviewed resources, specifically for parents. There's an organization called CNCF, the Children's Neuroblastoma Cancer Foundation, that has a parent handbook, which is an excellent resource for parents, including the newly diagnosed. So there's other avenues as well to gather as much information. And you can never have too much information. And I would encourage people to stay in this mindset of striving to educate yourself as much as you can, as often as you can throughout the whole treatment journey. It's critical to do that. You absolutely have to prepare yourself, as difficult as it might be, for what might come next. So you're in a certain phase of treatment, at a certain point in time, and you hope that goes well, and you hope there's no relapse, or there's no refractory disease, or there's no bumps in the road. But you need to be realistic, and you need to understand that, hey, there's a chance that that could happen, and I need to be prepared as mom and dad to take the next step. Because when it does happen, you don't have a lot of time to make key decisions. So the more educated you are as a parent, the more empowered you are to make the best decision for your child. If we're talking about what do I wish I would have known, right? One of the first things that comes to mind is the toxicity of the treatments that my son was enduring, and the long-term impact of those toxicities had he survived. I say that, but the sad reality is, you as a parent don't have the luxury of rejecting a therapy because of its toxicity. You're fighting for today, and you're really deferring decisions about tomorrow because you have no choice. And that's a heartbreaking place for a parent to be in. I do think understanding what the reality is of any given therapy, not only for today, 6 months from now, but 6 years from now, hopefully 60 years from now, right, is going to have on a child, is helpful. I don't think it can help necessarily guide yes or no decisions on treatment, because you're forced, in most instances, to have to expose your child to these awful toxicities. But understanding them, I guess, is my point, is I think important to the extent that that's possible. I would turn the question around a little bit and say, what would I, as a parent, like the world to know about the high-risk neuroblastoma patient experience? And the way that I would answer that question is, what young children, young kids like my son are forced to endure really verges on being medically and morally unacceptable. That's how toxic this regimen is. And everybody shares this view. You talk to treating clinicians in the neuroblastoma space, and they will tell you all day long they hate what they have to do to our kids to get them hopefully to a place where they're cured. And you often hear the phrase, cure is not enough. And I love that phrase. So that's a mantra that you hear in the neuroblastoma research and clinical community. Like, what we have to do to these kids to get them to a place where they survive, if they're fortunate enough to be a survivor, is unacceptable. The toxicities are unacceptable. And we really have to do better by these kids, as a society. I think one experience is, nobody is ever going to understand what you're going through as a parent, unless you're talking to another parent, right, with a child with neuroblastoma. But it's impossible to understand what moms and dads go through in this circumstance. And that's difficult because you find yourself in a place where you're almost in an alternate universe in this neuroblastoma world, and then there's reality over here, right? And navigating those two worlds is so hard because nobody understands it unless you're in it. I don't know that I've got a lot of good advice on that. I think you got to hold your close friends close and hope that your close friends hold you close. But that's another piece of this that I think, bears recognition and understanding. Maybe for the community of folks out there who are friends with neuroblastoma parents, keep that in mind. It's unimaginable what parents go through. And, as a friend, you're not going to have all the answers all the time. But I can tell you that when you are supportive and empathetic and curious about what's happening with a child, that's very, very greatly appreciated every single time. After Evan passed away in 2010, when he was 7, my wife and I decided that we wanted to honor his fight and we wanted to continue his fight by serving other patients and other families. So we established the Evan Foundation, 2011. And of course, Evan was our son's name, but it's also an acronym in the title of the foundation. So it stands for Evan's Victory Against Neuroblastoma. And our goal is simple: bring joy to kids with cancer today and drive progress for a better tomorrow. And we do that through a variety of patient and survivor wellness, research and advocacy and education initiatives. People are looking for insights on research, courses of treatment, options that are available to them. How can they become an advocate? How can they help support, additional research and raise awareness of the disease? We receive a variety of inquiries from people about not only their individual patients, but also the neuroblastoma community and how they can become a part of trying to improve the situation for children with neuroblastoma. This is one of my favorite things to talk about. So this is something that we started way back in 2012, the Evan Foundation Treats and Treasures Cards program. It's a really simple thing. It's starting in the spring of 2012. My wife, Wendy, and I started going to the hematology oncology floor at Children's National in DC with 2 carts, one stacked with treats, fun things to eat, all sorts of candy and snacks and chocolate and you name it. And then the other cart stacked full of treasures, toys and games and puzzles and all sorts of fun things for the kids. Yeah, we just started rounding those carts to every single room on the inpatient floor every Wednesday. And the response that we received, just overwhelming, just an incredible response to this simple act by both patients and parents and siblings. So, here we are in 2025. Tomorrow's Wednesday. We'll be rounding the Treats and Treasures carts tomorrow because we have done so every Wednesday since 2012. You add it all up, and it's something like 16,000 patient visits in Washington, D.C. And, because of the impact that this has had, giving kids a break from treatment, something to look forward to, and really empowering them. This is a key piece to this really simple program. It empowers these kids. They get an opportunity to choose items from the cart. They're in charge in an environment where everything is being done to them. And they're in the hospital for weeks at a time, months at a time, sometimes, well over a year. And so they have that empowerment, and that's very impactful as well. So we decided to expand the program, and we have done so. We are now approaching 30 hospitals that have Evan Foundation Treats and Treasures cards on their hematology, oncology, either inpatient floors or outpatient clinics. We buy the cart for them. We give them a grant every year to keep the cart well stocked. It's usually child life staff or nurses, sometimes volunteers who steward the program, steward the cart, and make the cart available to their patients. And the feedback we've received on this is overwhelming. And I never, ever in my wildest dreams would I ever have imagined that this simple little thing would have the impact that it's had. And, it's a guesstimate, but we're bringing smiles to approximately 1,500 kids a week across all those hospitals. So it's one of our favorite programs. So folks can reach us on social media and certainly on our website. It's www.evanfoundation.org. And we'd love to hear from people.